So welcome, Elly Desmarchelier, to the Commons Library. And
Thank you for having me.
thanks so much for being part of this webinar on making advocacy accessible and sharing your experiences in advocacy and campaigning and disability advocacy to help inform
Well,
our group.
it's pretty much the number one thing I'm passionate about. I love campaigning more than uh, anything to do. And if we can get more disabled people involved in campaigning, that's my dream come true.
Can you share a little bit about what kind of campaigning you've been involved in?
So I've been involved in the full spectrum of campaigning, from the traditional political party, election campaigning, right through to, individual issue campaigns, really small ones, campaigns to save bus routes and local schools to, last year I was the national spokesperson for the Defend Our NDIS campaign, which was a huge national campaign. So I've had experience as a campaign director, as a volunteer on the phones, and everything in between.
Fantastic. And I'm interested to know, how have campaigns that you've worked on welcomed participation and leadership by people with disability?
I think most campaigns that I've worked on have just stumbled upon participation of people with disability and then tried to welcome the best they can. I think the intention has been good, but they haven't proactively welcomed people with disability into the campaign. There's been a brave person with disability who has come forward and said they want to campaign, and then the campaign has hopefully tried to involve them in some way, and on a scale of clumsiness ranging from very unhelpful to what has been quite an inclusive experience.
Are there common barriers that you see, things that get in the way of people participating?
Well, can I say, for someone with a physical disability, campaigning is really, really inaccessible. So you think about the traditional ways of campaigning, and it is door knocking, it is like standing on the side of the street, and then you think of someone with an intellectual disability and it's writing letters to your local MP, and it's signing petitions, and it's making phone calls. For people with disability, campaigning is quite an inaccessible activity, no matter which one you choose. And so when we talk about barriers, there's barriers at each of the activities, depending on your disability. And so it's actually about working with the individuals to find the right fit. The number one failure, which is campaigns don't plan to have people with disability involved. So they get it wrong at the planning stage. They don't ever plan to have people with disability show up to call nights. They don't ever plan to have people with disability show up to a door knocking event or a rally or and because they don't plan, then they're chasing their tail when they do. And then that's a really hard thing to do, to make it accessible on the spot. But if you actually plan to have people with disability involved and then proactively engage the disability community, you'd find that we'd work with you to make your campaign more inclusive and accessible.
And as you mentioned, like, each campaign activity is going to have its barriers to access, which will look different for different people. Some people might find that tactic accessible, others won't. But some planning by campaigners at the outset of, like, we want to roll out this new action. How is that going to be for people who want to participate in it? Are there alternative ways people can take action? Are there things that can be done to make the action more accessible?
Yes. So that's what every Australian Counts does so well. And it is the exception to the rule on accessible campaigning here in Australia. It does things right in terms of, you looked at the Defend Our NDIS campaign, and that the team, if we were doing a campaign action that may be inaccessible to one part of the disability community, we made sure there was an alternative action or activity they could do to make sure their voice was heard. So there was never any activity done where someone couldn't do something. And that is really important. It might not be that we're all doing exactly the same thing in exactly the same way, but we all get to do something and contribute and have our voice heard in some way. And I think EAC does that because from the very start, from the planning stage, accessibility is the number one priority of campaigning.
And it just seems to make a whole lot of sense in terms of campaign impact to have those different channels for people to participate, because it means more people are taking action, adds up to more impact.
Well, let's remember 1 in 5 Australians have a disability. So in terms of volunteers for your campaign, that's a lot of feet on the ground. That's a lot of calls to be made. That's a lot of letters to be sent. You're missing out on a huge cohort if you're not thinking about how you involve people with disability in your campaign. Also, people with disability bring a perspective to your issue that is unique. It's an extra layer to whatever issue you're campaigning on in the social justice area that often is, we're double marginalized. And so we bring extra stories, extra persuasion to your cause. But you can't just use us for our stories and not include us in your campaign.
Talking about Every Australian Counts, such a fantastic campaign and so strong on accessibility because it's led by people with disability and the participants in the campaign have disability, that other campaigns that aren't around disability, if they have people with disability on their leadership team, their planning processes are going to be more effective.
As I said, 1 in 5 people have a disability in this country. If your campaign team has more than 5 people on it and you don't have a person with disability on there, you have to ask yourself why. You have to ask yourself if your campaign team actually reflects the community you're trying to campaign to, and whether you need to reach out and try and find a person with disability to join you, because that perspective is going to add so much value to your campaigning. Because otherwise you've really segregated people with disability from your campaign. But if you have people with disability on your campaign, reflecting the entire community, reflecting the diversity of the community, that will bring such value to your team, but also to your campaign strength and your ability to persuade people.
Just want to skip back to when we were talking about alternative actions. Do you have any examples of that?
So when I was campaign director for a traditional political campaign, I always made sure that when door knocking was happening, there was also a phone bank happening at the same time. So if you physically couldn't door knock, you could pick up the phone and make calls. That wasn't just for people with disability. There was elderly people who didn't feel like walking the streets for 2 hours was going to be good for them, but were happy to make phone calls for 2 hours. It gave people choice over what they wanted to do. I think I did in that campaign. We had a volunteer who just walked in off the street into the campaign office, and he was blind. And he was like, "I'm here to help." He's like, "I love door knocking, would love to door knock." And I sent him out on a few door knocks, and he was coming back and he was saying, "I don't mind it, but I'm just a bit frustrated. I can't get into a rhythm." And I was trying to understand what it was stopping him from being able to get into the flow of it. And in the end, through talking to him, we realized that each time he went out door knocking, he was sent with a different volunteer. So every time we just paired people up like on the spot. But for him, being paired up with the same person so they had the same process every time they went out door knocking was actually really effective. That person wrote down notes while he spoke. That person looked at, numbers on their house while he worried about where, his footing was. he felt like, it was more fast paced because they started to get into a rhythm with each other of who did what. And he didn't feel like his disability was slowing down, in his words, the door knocking. And so by the end of this pair, that we put together, door knocked more houses than any other people on the campaign. And he loved door knocking, like just thought it was the best thing in the world. And the way we worked it out, but we realized the barriers, and I listened to him, and we gave something a go, which was pairing him up with the same person. And I just think that's a really good example of, firstly, don't wait for the person with disability to come up and complain and say, there's this huge barrier in my way and I can't do this, because they don't want to make a big fuss. They don't want to be the problem on the campaign, the squeaky wheel. They want to be part of the team. They want to be helping. You need to reach out to them and make sure things are working. But secondly, people with disability don't automatically have all the answers. Just because we have the disability doesn't mean we have the problem solving ability right then and there. So it has to be a collaboration. I think what happens usually is people with disability, they're frustrated and they get frustrated at themselves and they think it's their fault that they can't fit into a campaign, and they just slowly walk away from it. And I think that's a real shame. I think it's on all of us to connect with people with disability who come into our campaigns and make sure they're feeling included and wanted.
Yeah. One thing I'm wondering about is when people first connect with a campaign, how campaigners can ask the right questions to figure out what might be needed in terms of accessibility. So it could be an onboarding process that, starts with a sign-up form, or it could be a face-to-face conversation. But what's your thoughts on this?
I find forms difficult to fill in about my accessibility. How do I put everything that my disability needs onto a piece of paper? I think it has to be a conversation. And you can go back, you can take notes, and you can go back and go, I'm just clarifying that I got this right and I understood you. But it has to start with a question as simple as, how can the campaign help to meet your disability needs? We want you to be part of our campaign. Is there anything we can do to help meet your disability needs? And let them talk. And if they say no, then that's fine. But always give them the chance to change their mind a few weeks later. Conversation. And the good thing is if you create an environment that's welcoming and inclusive, you'll have more than one person with disability. You'll have a group of them, and they'll work it out together. They'll start to voice it as a group. They'll start to problem solve as a group. This stuff gets easier the more you do it. I just want to say how easy it is to include people with disability. This is such a simple thing to do. It is about planning, it is about asking, and it is about listening. That's all it is. So plan to include people with disability in your campaign. Plan that they're going to show up to your march. I remember going to May Day marches, a decade ago, and it was like, oh my God, there's a wheelchair here. What are we going to do? Everybody freak out. But now they have different routes for people in wheelchairs if you don't want to do the full hill, and that changes everything. Plan for people with disability to be there. Ask questions. It's okay to ask questions. If someone is disabled, they've been asked way more intrusive questions than, how can I help? And then when you ask, listen to the response. It might make you uncomfortable. You might instantly think, we can't do that, but actually swallow it, think about it, ruminate on it, try and think of a way you can accommodate it. That's as simple as it is. Plan, ask, listen, then you will have an inclusive campaign, and you'll be lucky and to have some really talented, persuasive people on your side.
Excellent. Thank you, Elly.
Thanks, Holly, and thank you everyone for being part of today's webinar and for being interested in accessible campaigning. I really believe that campaigning should be a place for everyone, and people with disability have so much to say.